You are listening to Middle East Monitor Conversations, bringing you lively discussions with prominent voices from the region and beyond, as we delve deeper into issues shaping the Middle East and North Africa, from politics, the culture, and the arts.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Middle East Monitor, and I am Mohammed Hussein. And this is our weekly show. And here we have today with us our guest, Sami Hamdi. He is a managing director. He is the managing director of International Interests, Geopolitical Risk Consultancy Group. And he is here to talk to us today regarding Turkey's possible reconciliation with Syria and the possible consequences of that move. So, Sami, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me, Mohammed.
So, in recent weeks, over the past 2 months, I would say, or over the past half a year, actually, there have been signals that Turkey would be possibly reconciling with the Syrian regime, with Assad. It hasn't been clear, but there have been hints. And recently, Erdogan has said that the removal of Assad is not a goal of his. And the Turkish foreign minister has said that there are no preconditions for dialogue with the Syrian regime. So can you tell us what are the exact reasons for the possible reconciliation? Why this sudden change after 10 years?
Thank you very much for having me, Mohammed. I think it's important, first and foremost, to remember that one, Turkey is not the only country that is seeking to reconcile with Bashar al-Assad and seeking to restore him into the diplomatic fold and facilitate his rehabilitation. And the second point that's worth noting is that Turkey was not necessarily fully behind the revolution against Bashar al-Assad. And there was a Turkish delegation in the beginning, in the outbreak of the protest, that tried earnestly to convince Bashar al-Assad to hold early elections to stem the crisis, as opposed to lending its support to the Syrian revolution. I think what's important is that when you look at these two dynamics, then it becomes abundantly clear that Turkey's policy in Syria has never been driven by the idea of delivering a Syrian revolution. It's never been driven by the idea of achieving the aims of those Syrians who took to the streets, but primarily Turkey's aim has been about how do we adapt to this unfolding situation that is posing some very difficult questions for us, some very difficult security challenges, and some very difficult diplomatic challenges. And this is why when we look at the way that Turkey has approached Syria, we haven't seen any advancing of the forces or groups that claim to be part of the Syrian revolution. We haven't necessarily seen a reversal of Assad's momentum as he sought to regain territory with the support of Russians. But what we have seen is a continued Turkish stake in Syria. We've continued to see Turkey's involvement in Syria, Turkey doing enough to ensure that it sits at the table in Syria and has a say in how it is going to be governed. And the reason being is not that Erdogan does not have any sympathies for the Syrian revolution, but rather Ankara does not have confidence in its ability to deliver any Syrian revolution. Ankara does not have any confidence in its ability to stand up against Russia, Iran, and the US all at once. Turkey does not believe that it has the capacity to fulfill the desires of those Syrians who've taken to the streets. And it's in this context with which Turkey has approached the Syrian revolution, in that I never promised you I would bring down Assad. I never promised you I would deliver this revolution. We had converging interests in terms of Assad being antagonistic to both of us at the same time. And the time has come now, in light of the YPG and PKK threat, the Kurdish threat, in light of my warming ties with Russia, in light of Iranian militias cementing themselves, in light of my diplomatic isolation, in light of my domestic economic circumstance, in light of the rising anti-Syrian refugee sentiment in Turkey, I now have to take decisions that are still governed by the very same sentiments with which Turkey embarked on its Syria project, which is that it doesn't have the capacity to support the Syrian revolution, so it never fully supported it. And the support of the Syrian revolution was not an aim, but rather a tool through which to adapt to this situation, adapt to the security threat, and adapt to the unfolding crisis that took place in Syria. If we look at Turkey's foreign policy from this angle, then this reconciliation was always coming. This reconciliation was always going to happen. It was only a matter of when and not if. And now we're seeing Erdogan essentially saying, look, I need to move Syrian refugees out of Turkey. To do that, I need an agreement with Assad. I need an agreement on a safe zone. I don't want to give up territories in Syria, but I can come to an arrangement by which Assad facilitates the return of the refugees from Turkey. And now it's about Turkey trying to find some agreement with Assad, with the Russians, with the Iranians, with the Americans, to find some sort of stability on that border as Erdogan returns to focus on domestic politics, specifically in what will be one of the most difficult elections that he will have to face since his entire reign as ruler of Turkey.
So you mentioned that Turkey does what it does. It conducts its foreign policy based on its national interests, of course. And it's never truly been behind the Syrian revolution entirely, because it wasn't its main interest. However, there was a possibility last year, and since 2020 in particular, and in particular after the Turkish airstrikes on the Syrian regime forces, there was a chance that Turkey would support a new offensive, according to analysts, against the Syrian regime if the Syrian opposition groups actually launched it. There was that possibility, regardless of the ceasefire agreements. What happened there? Why was that discarded? Is it due to the inaction of the Syrian opposition groups? Is it because of the disunity amongst them, or is it based on something else?
I think that it's important to highlight that Ankara has no moral ground with which to support some of these armed groups in Syria, primarily because in the eyes of the Americans, of the Russians, of the Iranians, of the Europeans, of the UAE, of Saudi Arabia, these groups are considered borderline extremist groups, or in fact considered extremist groups. And I think this has been the Achilles heel of the revolution, in that the inability of a force to emerge that can be presented to the world as a force that is worth supporting. I think the absence of this has been the Achilles heel of the revolution, and has hampered any attempt to really provide support for any group willing to fight Assad. And I think the reality is that this has been very difficult for many Syrians to stomach, but it is a reality, albeit I do argue that the emergence of these groups that are considered to be extremists is the result of the failure of the international community to support the likes of the Free Syrian Army, or to support the Syrians in their desire for a democratic transition and to overthrow the dictatorship. I do think that Turkey has never been especially serious in supporting any particular offensive. You will remember in 2018, 2019, when some of those groups entered Saraqib, when they entered that town, and it looked as if the offensive was really moving forward, so much so that Hezbollah in Lebanon had to cross the border again into Syria in order to help to drive back some of those groups. According to reports, the reason why Saraqib was lost within 24 hours was because the groups were shocked that Turkish drones that had helped to facilitate the offensive suddenly turned around and went back to base without informing anyone, implying that Turkey's goal in the offensive was rather to bare its teeth to Russia and Syria, but never really to deliver any real offensive in order to push back against Bashar al-Assad. This is not about any callous interest on the part of Turkey. I do think that sometimes when we say that Turkey is pursuing Turkish interest or the like, it does give this impression that there is a callousness with which Erdogan has approached the Syrian cause. I don't think Erdogan has approached it in a callous way. I do think that when Erdogan took in those refugees in Turkey, he knew he was going to pay a political price. He knew that the Turkish electorate would eventually turn against it, but he led from the front and said to the Turkish people that this is what we're going to do because it's the right thing to do. And I do think one of the reasons why he's reconciling with Assad today is because he doesn't feel he has the power to be able to lead from the front anymore, and he's succumbing to this popular pressure that is asking that Syrian refugees be kicked out and sent back. And that's why Erdogan is trying to use soft terms such as a voluntary return. But to your question directly, the reality is this: for Turkey, those groups that are in Idlib, or indeed those groups that are in Syria, Turkey does not envisage a strategy that sees them reaching the gates of Damascus. Turkey sees them as a tool through which to sit at the table with Russia and Iran, as a tool with which to strong-arm Assad, as a tool with which to extract concessions regarding the movement of the YPG and PKK, but also Erdogan privately, and I do think he believes this privately, envisages a Hatay situation whereby Assad has no recourse to regain these territories so long as the Turks Turks are there. Russia is unlikely to push because it wants to have Turkey as a friend to push back against the US. It may well be that Turkey will remain in Idlib, will remain in those areas where it is. It will not cede an inch of those territories to Bashar al-Assad, but come to this reconciliation where we have a divided Syria, Turkish-controlled Syria, a limited Kurdish-controlled Syria. Assad, I wouldn't say Assad-controlled, but Russia, Iranian controlled Syria. But the idea here being that for Turkey, any offensive or any idea of toppling Assad was never on the cards, not because Erdogan did not believe in the rights of the Syrians, but because Erdogan believed quite simply, I do not have the power with which to deliver on these goals. And I think what we're seeing now is this divergence in expectations, Syrians becoming very upset. But if you listen carefully to the Syrians, there has long been an acknowledgement that while they are grateful to Turkey for what it has done, they are aware that Turkey was never on board with their particular aims. And the direct answer to your question again is simply that Turkey backs offensives when it needs to squeeze Russia and pulls back when Russia concedes or pushes Assad to concede.
And if there is a reconciliation, if there is an official and full reconciliation, or even a partial one, do you think that the Assad regime and its forces and its allied forces and the Iranian militias, would you think that they would actually rein in or attempt to rein in the YPG and the SDF? Or do you think that they would stall on that process? Do you think that they would make excuses? What do you think would happen? Would they actually be true to their word if they did make such an agreement with Erdogan for that?
I think this is what's complicating the process for the Turks in particular, the idea as to how do we guarantee that what Putin is saying to us about reining in the PKK and YPG, what guarantees do we have that Assad will be able to fulfill that particular commitment, particularly given that the US see in the SDF and they see in the Kurdish forces a very valuable ally, and the Americans are still of the belief that they want to push for an autonomous Kurdish region in order to spite Assad and also to be able to rein in the Russians. The Americans have a big role to play here, and this is not, they are not isolated from this sort of negotiations that are taking place between Turkey, Russia, and between Bashar al-Assad. And I think here is where Turkey perhaps lacks clarity in terms of what it is after. Turkey knows what it wants, but is unsure how to achieve what it wants. Turkey knows that it can't trust Bashar al-Assad, but it needs Bashar al-Assad in order to get the Syrian refugees out of Turkey and in order to be able to establish security arrangements, such as one that existed for many decades that allowed Turkey to enter, I think it's 20 kilometers into the border to attack Kurdish groups without the permission of the Syrian government. Turkey is looking for similar security arrangements or the like. But the reason that there are so many question marks over this is primarily because what's driving the reconciliation is not entirely the idea of pursuing Turkish interests. It's more about Erdogan's domestic woes. It's about Erdogan trying to be seen to be doing something to appease a very angry Turkish population that is looking for anything to blame except the conduct of the government with regards to the economy. Erdogan is aware that the Syrian refugees are actually a benefit to the Turkish economy and not a blight on the Turkish economy in the way that some Turks have argued. However, the Syrian refugees are an easy target to blame for the economic woes. And I do think that a lot of this reconciliation with Bashar al-Assad is not necessarily driven by a desire for security agreements or the like. If Erdogan wanted security agreements on the PKK and YPG, he can continue to pressure the Americans, and I think that's the most effective way with which to do it, or he can strong-arm Assad through the Russians. There's no need to talk to Assad regarding this. Instead, here is where we see the influence of the MHP, of the MHP, of the nationalists who've always argued that there should be good ties with Bashar al-Assad, who've always argued that the Syrian refugees shouldn't be here, who've always argued that the Syrian issue has always been one of Erdogan's escapades that cascaded into a Turkish national security threat. I do think that when we're looking in terms of this reconciliation, what can be achieved, what it will look like, I think what Erdogan is after is an entrenchment of the status quo as opposed to a change in the status quo. What Erdogan is after is to keep control of Idlib, to keep control of those northwestern territories, to keep the presence of the Turkish patrols, and an agreement to get Assad to stay away from Idlib, to be content with the territories that he currently has, and sort of over the years try to build some warmer ties with regards to security and the like, depending, of course, in the fluctuation of Assad's power. But the idea here being that Erdogan doesn't want to give anything up, but rather he wants a reconciliation similar to what we saw in the reconciliation with the UAE and with Saudi Arabia. The idea here being that I'm not going to cede an inch of what I've gained in my foreign policy, but I'm prepared to put a pause in what I want to achieve in my foreign policy. They were content with that. He's hoping Assad will be content with that. I want to keep what I gained in Idlib, but I don't want to, but I will put a pause on what I want to achieve. The biggest problem Erdogan has, however, is that the protest by the Syrians in Idlib, in the Syrian territories, and indeed on social media, the scenes of the Turkish flag being burnt by some quarters of the Syrian population suggest that there is a huge divergence between the Syrians and between Erdogan. The Turks expect a gratitude of the Syrians that the Syrians believe they do not deserve. The Syrians believe that it is an honor to support the Syrian cause, and that the honor is not that Turkey supported the Syrian cause. And this is where perhaps we see this divergence and a very awkward debate emerging regarding which takes precedence. Turkey, because of what it has given to the Syrian revolution, or the Syrian revolution itself, the rights of the Syrians to live in a free country. What Erdogan is asking of the Syrians is to set aside the priority of their rights and their pursuit of a nation in which they can live free in exchange for his electoral woes and electoral problems. And I think this is what has cast a cloud over the entire debate regarding this particular reconciliation, which, if you look at it away from the emotions, might actually serve the revolution better insofar as it might give a breathing space for the opposition groups to regroup and consider maybe in the 5-10 years to relaunch another offensive to bring down Assad.
Now, there's a lot of questions regarding if Turkey does reconcile, what will happen, and what will happen with the refugees, etc. But one question I do want to ask regarding what you just touched on is how will, let's talk about the refugees first. So if relations between Syria and Turkey do get fully restored, then how do you think Erdogan, or even another president after the 2023 elections, that's because that ties in with it and it's very important. But say Erdogan for now, how would the return of refugees be engineered? How would it be conducted? Would it be voluntary, as he wants it to be apparently? Would it be forced? Would it be under the table, as in, finding excuses to deport Syrian refugees, as has reportedly happened in the past 2 years or so? How would it be conducted, do you think?
That's a difficult question, and one I hope will not get me barred from going to Istanbul. But I think that in 2018, when Erdogan wanted to score a point with the European Union, he let the refugees cross the sea into Greece. And the Greeks started shooting against those refugees, and Erdogan said, look how the Greeks are treating those refugees. But the glaring point that stood out for me was that Erdogan, before releasing those refugees, before allowing them to go to Greece, he knew they would be shot at. He knew they would be tortured. He knew what Greece was going to do to those refugees. He knew what the Greek patrols were going to do to the refugees, and still he believed that the goal of scoring a point against Europe was worth letting those refugees go to Greece. The reason I mention this is because this is where the fear comes in terms of pushing the refugees back to Syria, in that Erdogan will view his responsibility to the refugees in terms of facilitating their return to Syria, but what happens to them in Syria will not be his responsibility. And this is what I fear the most, the idea being that there will not be a voluntary return to Syria. No Syrian in their right mind wants to return to areas in which Assad is essentially becoming stronger. I do think there will be forced returns depending how the election goes. If Erdogan does better than expected, it may well be he will delay or put a hold on it. If he does badly, he may well push it in order to try to appease some of the more nationalist elements. But those Syrian refugees, they will be forced to go. We know that the Syrian opposition are under pressure to be quiet over Erdogan's bid for reconciliation with the Assad. The Turks are saying to them, listen, if you either be silent or you have to leave from here, we can't continue to support you on this particular basis. People have noticed the absence of any statements on the part of the Syrian refugees. But if we take the example of the refugees that were sent to Greece and who were shot at, I do think that the plan, or rather what the plan for removing the refugees from Turkey is one in which they are forced to go back to Syria. Erdogan will try to establish a safe zone, a 30-kilometer area that will be part of the deal he will try to strike with Bashar al-Assad. That doesn't mean Assad will abide by it, nor the Iranian militias. If anything happens to those refugees in the safe zone, Erdogan will argue that this is Assad's fault and not his fault, even if perhaps he anticipated that this might happen. And I think here is where the darkness of what is unfolding before us becomes abundantly clear, in that the refugees that Erdogan once welcomed and once told the Turkish people that I don't care about the political price, we need to take in those Syrian refugees. We're now seeing a much more pragmatic Erdogan saying, look, at the end of the day, I don't have the capacity. I'm unable to deliver the revolution. The Turkish electorate are my priority. I'm a Turkish president first before I am a Muslim president or a leader of the Syrians. We know that Syrians have often affectionately referred to Erdogan as a sultan, as perhaps he's referred to in many places in the Muslim world. We're now seeing Erdogan sort of trying to balance between these two, but pragmatism forcing him to choose the Turkish president robe. And this is where I think we see the greatest fear or the greatest crime that might be committed, which is in pursuit of this reconciliation with Bashar al-Assad. For Erdogan, the safety of the Syrians is not paramount. The Syrians are but a tool through which to appease the Turkish electorate, and also to appease Assad by saying, look, you can also market it as Syrians coming back voluntarily to Syria, as the situation getting better in Syria, as you no longer being this raging monster that the world painted you out to be. We will see articles abroad of people saying, okay, if Assad is so bad, why are the Syrian refugees voluntarily returning to Syria? And this is where I think it's a very dark chapter emerges. But it's important to highlight here, and I'll finish on this particular point, it's important to stress here, this doesn't mean Erdogan doesn't have sympathy for the Syrians, but what is unfolding before us instead is that Erdogan believes that he's under heavy pressure, and when he's under heavy pressure, everybody is expendable, except of course Turkish citizens. We know that, for example, the Turkish ambassador to Israel was withdrawn not because of Palestine, but because there were Turkish casualties on the flotilla that was going to Gaza. And now we're seeing the ambassador returned to Israel, and Mahmoud Abbas of the Palestinian Authority going to Turkey to play his part in this decoration to sort of try to get Erdogan to temper the public backlash over the returning of the ambassador. The point here being is that the Syrians are not Turks. They are not Erdogan's priority. Erdogan will try to push them back into Syria in this safe zone. He will do his best to try to prevent any atrocities being committed. But if they are committed, Erdogan will absolve himself of all responsibility and essentially blame Assad for it, even if perhaps I do believe he will have to share some of the blame for it.
So earlier we touched upon, or you touched upon, the Syrian opposition and how it will view all this. And I want to ask, there's been in all of the disunity of the Syrian opposition with regards to the SNC, the Syrian National Coalition, which is the officially recognized Syrian opposition in the world, or other groups, whether it's Islamist groups, whether it's other secular groups, whether it's the FSA, all of these groups, the Syrian opposition is largely disunited. How would they react, or how would they react to the Turkish reconciliation, or to demands that they should reconcile themselves with Assad? Do you think that they would? Do you think there's a possibility that one day the Syrian opposition, whichever group it is, or the official one, would reconcile with the Assad regime? Do you think that's a possibility?
I think that I'm trying to word this so I'm not misunderstood. Let's split the Syrian people from the Syrian opposition, because those who protested on the streets at Çavuşoğlu, at the Turkish foreign minister's statements, were the Syrian people. They came out to the street and they said, we will not reconcile with Bashar al-Assad. what I'm going to refer to in my following statement is not referring to these people, it's referring to the particular armed groups. The armed groups are essentially surviving on life support from Turkey, but for Turkey, they would not be able to continue dominating in the territories that they are in. It is Turkey that has helped them to essentially maintain their presence, that has helped them to maintain their territory. It is Turkey that has been trying to influence them to get rid of some of the more extreme elements. Turkey has been trying for some years to try to present them as a body that is worth defending internationally, but they of course have not played game. They come out and they provide harbor perhaps to controversial figures and the like, and that has made it very difficult for Turkey to continue backing them, or even for Turkey to even consider the prospect of helping them in any particular offensive. And I do think that what killed the Syrian refugee, I won't say killed, I do think it's still alive, but what harmed it the most was the inability of those who wanted to bring down Assad to rein in the emergence of the extremist groups, particularly following the defeat of the FSA at the hands of Hezbollah in Qusayr and these other various different places in 2014, 2015, and of course after the Russian intervention. I do think that when we're looking at those particular armed groups, once Turkey reconciles, their options are significantly limited, and I think that they will be forced to be content with their fiefdoms in Idlib or the like. But I think given US pressure on Turkey to try to deal with extremist elements, I do think that it may well be that Turkey today that was an ally will become an enemy for them tomorrow as it seeks to rein them in and contain them, and as it tries to shore up or try to appease Assad in terms of the composition of these groups that are in Idlib. The Syrian people is a different situation altogether, primarily because, as Ibn Khaldun famously said, الظلم مؤذن بخراب العمران, that oppression heralds the end of a dynasty or the end of a civilization. Even if Assad restores himself or restores control over these territories, it won't stop the Syrians protesting or the Syrians trying to resist. It won't allow Assad to restore his control over those particular territories. And I think that what we saw in the Syrian protest was that the fire of resisting Assad is still very much alive, and it may well be that even if Assad feels that he is strong, he will struggle to establish the stability and the security that he needs in order to be able for himself to become independent of Russia and independent of Iran. The second point that is worth noting is that when it comes to these particular groups, Turkey may reconcile with Assad but not leave those particular territories. So these groups, if they're thinking about an offensive against Assad, they will find that part of Turkey staying in Syria means Turkey preventing any offensive. It means Turkey ensuring that the Syrian opposition no longer threaten Assad. In other words, if Assad is going to agree for Turkish forces to stay in northwestern Syria, the condition will be that Turkey prevents any manifestation of the Syrian revolution in a manner that affects Bashar al-Assad's regime. And this is where perhaps we have another dark dilemma, in that the Syrian opposition is entirely dependent on Turkey in order to exist. But now it will find itself equally restricted by Turkey, which will find that the reconciliation agreement is dependent on it preventing any particular threat to the Assad regime in exchange for preserving Turkey's security over the against the PKK and YPG. And this is why I mentioned earlier the idea of which takes priority, Turkey's interests or the rights of the Syrians to live in a free and democratic Syria. And where is the honor? Is the honor that Turkey supported you, or the honor that the Syrian revolution is something that is worth supporting in and of itself, and anyone supporting it should feel honored themselves? And this is why I think that when it comes to those particular armed groups, they don't have the power to subvert any agreement between Turkey and Assad. If they do, it is likely that Turkey will allow these groups to be defeated by Russia, by Iranian militias, and by Bashar al-Assad. These groups will be aware that it is a zero-sum game for Turkey. They're unlikely to try any particular offensive. And this is why the Syrians are so upset about the reconciliation between Turkey and Assad, because they're interpreting it as an offer by Turkey that we are ready to recognize you and we will now help you against the Syrian desire to see your regime fall, albeit it's a bit more complicated than that, but that's the baseline of what is unfolding before us. The Syrian people, and I'll finish on regarding this question on this point, the Syrian people, however, when you look at the numbers that came out to protest, when you look at the way in which they turned on Turkish sentiment, when they're turning on them and saying to the Turkish sentiment that, listen, we are humans as well, we have our right to freedom and prosperity, it may well be that instead of bringing the security and stability that Turkey is after, this reconciliation will further entrench armed groups. It will further entrench the very instability that Turkey is seeking to deal with, in that we might see new groups emerge, we might see new pockets of Syrian resistance emerge in such a manner that it undermines Turkey, it undermines Assad, it undermines that reconciliation agreement, and we may well see a deterioration between Turkey and Assad in the long term that puts Turkey back into square one, whereby it finds itself trying to resist Assad once more. But that won't happen in the short term. That's a long-term phenomenon.
I mean, even before the possibilities of Turkey reconciling with Assad, even before that, in the years previously, we saw that some opposition groups, such as Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, some other groups linked with Al-Qaeda, they expressed disappointment or displeasure with Turkey and its presence in northwest Syria. So we've seen that kind of displeasure already. And you mentioned that, I'm going to finish on this point. I'm going to finish on this question. The Syrian opposition, if Turkey and Syria do reconcile, and if they do restore ties, and if the Syrian opposition does not have a base in Turkey anymore, like it does currently, or will it maybe? Where would it be? Where would its base be? Will it be homeless? Will it be? Will its base still be in Turkey? Is that a possibility, or will it be centered in a different place? What do you think about that?
All these questions are tragedies. I think that when we look at the concessions that Turkey has made to Egypt in a bid to try to get Sisi to reconcile without meeting Erdogan, I think the sticking point in the reconciliation is Sisi wants to be seen publicly with Erdogan in order to humiliate him and say to the Egyptian people, look how Turkey has come to me. I think that when you look at the concessions that Erdogan has made, such as ordering the shutting down of the Muslim Brotherhood channels, ordering them to be silent, ordering them to be silent on social media as well. Mu'taz Matar, even though he had a show cancelled, tried to present his show on social media. The Turks came and said to him, listen, it includes social media, you're not allowed to speak here. What we saw is the Muslim Brotherhood go back to where they found their haven in the 1990s and the 2000s. They went back to London, they went back to Toronto, they went back to Paris, they went back to Europe, and now they have become essentially ineffective. They've essentially become unable to really apply any pressure on Abdel Fattah al-Sisi or on Cairo or the like. And the Turkish sentiment is not necessarily one of callousness as to this is who we are, this is Turkey, and you have to abide by it, but more, listen, we don't have the capacity, we're really sorry about this, but this is the way that it has to be. And you know, we tried and we're unable to do so, even if I do feel perhaps that sometimes Turkish analysts are a bit obnoxious online in the manner in which they approach it, which is, you know, how dare you be ungrateful and the like. I do think that privately, behind the scenes, amongst the diplomats, the conversations are very different. The conversations are more, we really sympathize with you, but we really can't do much. And we have this crisis that we need to deal with. And I think that's why the Syrian opposition are not denouncing Turkey with regards to the reconciliation. I'm talking about the political opposition in Istanbul and in Turkey. It's why Hamas has not decried Turkey over its restoration of the ambassador to Israel. It's why the Muslim Brotherhood of Egypt have not denounced Turkey over his pursuit of reconciliation with Cairo. It's because the language that's being conveyed to them privately is one of regret and one of unfortunate circumstances. In answer to your question, it basically means that the Syrian opposition, or the political opposition, which doesn't enjoy much popular support, if we're brutally honest, they're a very impotent organization in and of themselves, primarily because of the inability of them to find a synergy with the groups that are on the ground, with the armed groups that are on the ground, but that's a different issue altogether. I think that they will find themselves forced to return to Paris with their tails between their legs. They will be forced to return to London. They'll be forced to be limited to social media, to denouncing Assad and criticizing Assad, and hoping for a better geopolitical circumstance that might see the Americans refuse this reconciliation with the Assad. I think that one of the strange ironies of what's unfolding in Syria is that it is the Americans who are staunchly anti-Assad still. It is the Americans who are hell-bent on ensuring that Assad is not rehabilitated, to the extent that the UAE has been struggling a lot in order to resume its ties with Bashar al-Assad after trying to restore its ambassador and trying to restore investment ties. It's the US that shut down Saudi Arabia's attempt to reconcile with Bashar al-Assad al-Assad and restore its ambassador. The Syrians were very excited. The Syrian ambassador to Lebanon spoke about how Saudi Arabia is a dear country and a brotherly country. Saudi Arabia was forced to be shut down by Washington over a reconciliation with Bashar al-Assad. It may well be that the Syrian opposition now, given that Erdogan now is essentially pursuing this reconciliation with Assad, that they will find better luck now in Washington, which views Syria from the lens of pushing back Russia, which views Syria from the lens of containing Iran. And I think that what we will see from the Syrian opposition is not necessarily a lack of options, but rather a regret that at the end of the day, a Muslim power that offered its support and that perhaps suggested the greatest challenge to Bashar al-Assad, when the full circle came back, the reality is still that it is the Western countries upon which they must rely on. It is the Western countries that they must continue to lobby, and it is the Western countries that remain the greatest hope of achieving anything remotely similar to the aims with which the Syrians set out to achieve when they came out to the streets against Bashar al-Assad.
That is a strange dichotomy. I've noticed that too. But as you said, as you mentioned, the US is against Assad for their own interests, for containing Iran, for countering Russia. Thank you, Sami, for your time. Thank you for your insights, and it's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much for having me. Appreciate it. Thank you.
This was Middle East Monitor Conversations, brought to you by the Middle East Monitor in London.